said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. We are in the house of the Lord this morning, not because we're in this building, but because as the temple of Christ, through the indwelling of the Spirit of God, the church is the temple of God. And when we come to worship God, we are in a unique way in His presence. To show our faith in God and our appreciation for what He has done and continues to do for us. And so it is good to see each of you here this morning in God's presence. Diane Odell developed a form of polio at the age of 13. And she had to be put in what is called an iron lung. And she had to stay in that iron lung through the rest of her life. She was not able to get out of the iron lung because of her polio. There were other equipment, apparatus that someone with polio as she has could use, but because of other health problems, she was not able to do that. In middle school and high school, she was able to do her studies as fellow students came to visit her and teachers came to teach her in school. And she would dictate her papers and so forth. She learned to write with her toes. She could not get out of that machine, but she took classes at Free Hardeman University through correspondence. She was not able to finish. Free Hardeman gave her an honorary degree in 1987 because of her efforts. There are only about 30 people, as far as I know, today who live in this iron lung. It's through positive and negative pressures. It pushes air into her lungs, push air into her lungs, and pull air out of her lungs to help her breathe. She had had problems at one time when the power went out, and her family had to use some kind of hand-operated machine to pump air into her lungs. And so the electric company in her area donated a generator, a backup generator, so that she would continue to have the energy that she needs to operate this iron lung. But then in May of 2008, just a few years ago, another power outage took out the electricity, and for whatever reason, the generator did not work either, and Diane Odell passed away in May of 2008. But she could not leave that machine for almost 60 years. Mankind is in an iron lung. Mankind cannot make it to heaven. We are trapped inside a spiritual iron lung if we do not receive God's help. Man has to have assistance from God in order to make it back to God, to heaven. We need help. This morning I want us to see that principle play out in the life of Naaman. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. If you're using the Bible in the pew, it is page 311. 2 Kings chapter 5. Naaman was a commander of the armies of Syria, the king of Aram, as some translations word it. He was a great man with his master, and he was highly respected because the Lord had given him victory through him to the country of Syria, or Aram. Naaman was a valiant warrior, a mighty warrior, but he was a leper. It doesn't matter how good things go sometimes. Every individual has a problem. If you look back at Naaman, the Bible here says, the historian writes that Naaman was a captain of an army. You cannot become a commander of an army without a great deal of charisma, courage, determination. He had inherent leadership qualities, and that's how he got to be in the position that he was in. He was a man of courage, and you and I admire men like that. And Naaman earned the respect and the admiration of the people around him. The Bible here says that he was a great man with his master, the king of Syria. What does it take for a commander of an army to earn the respect of the king? Well, it means that the king recognized in Naaman that Naaman was not after the throne. The king had trust in Naaman that he was not going to lead some kind of coup d'etat against the king. He was not after the throne. He was trustworthy. He was the kind of man who took orders. He was the kind of man who delegated responsibility. He was the kind of man that the king of Syria could say, do this, and he did it. That's the kind of man Naaman was. He was a man's man. Dependable, strong, courageous, trustworthy. And he had a great deal of respect. He was highly respected here, the Bible says, because the Lord had given through him victory to Aaron. And so the people were able to recognize the leadership, the personality of Naaman, and they respected him. And God, the God whom you and I serve, gave Naaman victory over the nation of Israel. Now we may step back and ask, well, why did God give victory over his people to a nation that worshiped false gods? I don't have an answer to that. But we'll see a possible answer for it in just a moment. The Bible goes on to say that Naaman was a valiant warrior. They did not have machine guns back then, but Naaman could take apart an arrow and put it back together in 2.3 seconds. That's the kind of warrior Naaman was. But he was a leper. You and I understand that the word leprosy in the Bible describes a range of skin diseases, but in particular, it tended to be a disease that was contagious. It would affect the nerves and body parts would eventually decay, sometimes fall off. So it was contagious, and a lot of those required Israelites that had leprosy to stay away from the rest of the Israelites. They were social outcasts. The Syrians didn't look at it that way. And so Naaman was able to be a leper and be a commander of the army at the same time. And yet, they still recognized by the king of Israel's response that we read in verse 7. They recognized that only the God in heaven could cure leprosy. Now, man has a problem today. Spiritual leprosy, or sin, is every man's problem. When the Bible pictures forgiveness of sins in terms of cleansing, as it does in John 15, verse 3, and 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and verse 11, it is picturing sin as being a spiritual leprosy. That mankind needs cleansing. Every accountable person chooses at some point to do something that God considers sin against his nature, against his law. And from that point on, we deal with spiritual leprosy. Everybody's got that problem. Every man and woman, teenager, has the problem of spiritual leprosy. Well, in the case of Naaman, there's a little girl that had the solution to the problem. Look at verses 2 through 5. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel. And she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, and that he would cure him of his leprosy. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, Thus and thus spoke the girl who is from the land of Israel. And so the king of Aram said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 changes of clothes. That little girl who was kidnapped from the land of Israel. Now you may ask yourself this question, why did God allow that little girl to be kidnapped? Because we see back there in verse 1, this was brought about by the Lord. The Lord gave victory to Abraham over his own people. Why? How can you consider it kind that God would allow that little girl, we don't know how old she was, to be kidnapped, to be taken from her mommy and her daddy, taken to a foreign land? I don't know the answers to all of life's questions, and I don't know all of God's thoughts. But here's what I propose. God used that little girl to bring healing to Naaman. I don't know what was going through this little girl's mind. We know some things that we see revealed here. This little girl waited on Naaman's wife. She was not bitter because she had been kidnapped. Maybe she understood that it was just as close to God from Aram, Syria, as it was from Israel. Maybe she realized truly that it doesn't matter what land you live in, you just serve God. Maybe she understood that. Something else that I see in this young lady, verse 3, she says, I wish my master were with a prophet who was in Samaria. She wasn't bitter and said, I'm going to keep this information to myself. This man kidnapped me from my mom and dad. He gets what he deserves. I hope the leprosy kills him fast. She didn't say that. It is a principle of the God of heaven that his people should not glory when they see their enemy fall. Proverbs 24, verse 17. You and I are more familiar with the words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Bless your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you and despitefully use you. And that's what this young girl is doing here. And she knows that there's a prophet in Samaria. And the prophet she's referring to is Elisha. Now, Elisha is the great miracle-working prophet in the Old Testament. There's not a prophet in the Old Testament that does more miracles than Elisha. Elisha raised the dead. Elisha was able to feed 100 people with a few loaves of barley and a few grains of few ears of corn. Elisha was able to throw a pinch of salt into some soup and take the poison out. Elisha was able to make an iron axe head float in water. Those are the kind of miracles that are ascribed to Elisha, some 13 miracles. And this young lady knew Elisha's reputation. And I find it striking that this young girl also believes that Elisha, the prophet of the God of heaven, will perform this miracle on Naaman, who is a pagan Gentile. That's the kind of understanding that this young girl had.